Hi everyone, welcome to my new season of How Canadian Government Works, and I hope you enjoy this one. Today we're beginning with none other than the Prime Minister. So the term Prime Minister really comes from the French Premier Minister, which was first used by Louis XIV to describe his chief advisor or his Prime Minister. The term really encompassed, being chiefly responsible for the sovereign for the day-to-day running of the sovereign's government. The term later evolved into disuse for the Louis. The Louis XV seldom used it, and Louis XVI never used it. The term came back into use in Britain in the 18th century, where you had a number of different roles fulfilled by the one we call the Prime Minister. The title evolved from the Minister of the Crown to the Chief Minister, to the Premier Minister, and finally to the Prime Minister. Many Prime Ministers at this time refused to use the term Prime Minister because they thought it to be really derogatory. At this time, the Prime Minister was a sole employee of the Crown, and the Crown could yank them whenever they saw fit, or even worse, as Oliver Cromwell did, execute them. The modern theory, when Canada adopted responsible government, the role of Prime Minister became part of the Canadian government, and a series of customs began in Canada regarding the Prime Ministers. The Prime Minister is ultimately, as it was under Louis, the chief servant of the Crown, and by the Crown, the Canadian people in our parliamentary system. The Prime Minister is usually the leader of the party which has the most seats in the House of Commons, although constitutionally anyone who can probably hold the confidence of the House could be Prime Minister. So in a minority government situation, the Governor General could even ask the leader of the party which has the second most seats in the House to form a government, even though another party has more seats, if the party which he or she asks to form the government is most likely to form a government. The Prime Minister is appointed by the Governor General or the Premiers are appointed at the provincial level by the Lieutenant Governor, and holds office during royal pleasure, which means that until a successor is appointed, the Prime Minister remains in office. Contrast that to the President of the United States, which every 4 years on January 20th, no matter how many times they're president, have to be sworn back in and really forms a new government. The Prime Minister has a few main duties. The first is to be responsible for the administration of the cabinet, and by the cabinet, all departments of the federal government. The Prime Minister recommends the appointments to the sovereign of his ministers. Each one of them runs a department on their own. If the Prime Minister should lose confidence in any of his ministers' ability to function, the Prime Minister could in fact remove that person from the government, thereby asking someone else to come and fill that role. The Prime Minister is responsible through each one of his ministers for the operations of all government departments. The Prime Minister also becomes the de facto chief spokesperson for the Government of Canada. He is responsible for all policies decisions made by the government, and ultimately is responsible to ensure that those decisions are communicated clearly to the electorate and to the House of Commons. The duties of the Prime Minister are interesting because they're not found in statute. There is only one time when the Prime Minister is mentioned in our constitutional acts, and that is to create a constitutional conference every 10 years. Besides that, there is no mention of the Prime Minister in our Constitution. it has evolved into our understanding through several important things, which are other acts of Parliament and our understanding of how the Prime Minister functions. The Prime Minister is still technically the first among equals of the Cabinet. However, his power to hire and fire ministers really puts him on a higher plane in the Cabinet and no longer makes him the first among equals. The Prime Minister is ultimately responsible to the Canadian people through Parliament. Parliament can decide to vote non-confidence in the government, which would rather trigger a new election or a fresh appointment of a new Prime Minister and new government. The Prime Minister holds office until the House of Commons votes no confidence and they face the election and loses. The Governor General asks the leader of the opposition to form a government. They resign, they are removed by the Governor General, or they die. We have yet to, in Canadian history, have a Prime Minister that was removed by the Governor General. The closest we had was William Lyon Mackenzie King, who resigned after the Governor General refused to take his advice. You had a number of different Prime Ministers in Canadian history who has lost votes of confidence in the House of Commons and then have gone on to call an election and lose that election. Most recent, Paul Martin or even Joe Clark. You have had a number of different Prime Ministers who have retired. And we have had a number of different Prime Ministers who have retired and then came out of retirement. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, I'm looking at you. We have had two Prime Ministers die in office. Mackenzie King, John A. Macdonald and Sir John David Spiro Thompson both died in office, and they were replaced by the government leader in the Senate in both times. You've had a number of different Prime Ministers who have had seats in the House of Commons. However, we've had two Prime Ministers who have actually had seats in the Senate. We've had, by convention, the Prime Minister must have a seat in either House, although it is usually the House of Commons. And if they're not able to have a seat in the House of Commons, they must try to get one as soon as possible. The Prime Minister is usually leader of the political party with most seats in the House of Commons, and each political party is free to choose their leader in whatever method they choose. Usually it's a one member. Usually in modern politics, it's a rather one member, one vote convention held throughout Canada, or actually a physical party convention held in one location. The constitutional theory behind the Prime Minister is kind of interesting. As I mentioned before, nothing's actually written down, but you do have a number of different, really duties which Prime Minister have. Really, you have the duty to chair cabinet and be responsible for government department. You have the duty as our de facto head of government to oversee the operations of the federal public service, including the military. You have the power to advise the Governor General on many occasions, to probe Parliament, declare war, declare peace, dissolve Parliament, call elections, appoint senators. And finally, you have the role as the leader of the government party to promote government policies and to eventually seek re-election and be the spokesperson for those policies. So that's my overview of the theory behind the office of Prime Minister. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back soon.